I first saw the photograph on a damp October evening in 2004, when the light outside had already gone soft and the rain streaked the windows in long, tired lines. It had been a slow day at the Surrey estate auction, and I'd bought a small box of old family albums, mostly out of habit. I used to tell myself I was rescuing fragments of forgotten lives, giving the past somewhere to breathe. In truth, I think I was searching for something, though I wouldn't have been able to tell you what. The photograph was tucked among a pile of wedding memorabilia, pressed flowers, brittle ribbons, a few letters that still carried the faint perfume of another century. I remember the feel of the paper when I unfolded it, thick, glossy fiber stock, heavier than most prints from the period. The auctioneer had said it was taken in the 1930s, and that seemed right. The people were too well fed, too comfortably dressed to have belonged to the leaner decades that followed. At first glance, it was simply a family portrait, a wedding party, arranged in deliberate rows outside a country house. The groom, square-jawed and dapper, stood beside a young woman whose expression held the restrained joy of someone aware she was being watched. Behind them clustered a dozen guests, elderly parents, sisters, friends, a few children fidgeting at the edges of the group. The house itself stood solid and sunlit, its windows reflecting a pale sky, and yet there was something that unsettled me from the start. It was subtle, nothing one could name outright. Perhaps it was the stillness of their faces, the way none of them looked quite at the camera, their gazes tilted slightly away as though distracted by something else. The shadows, too, were wrong. The light fell from the left, but several figures cast no shadow at all. I thought it might have been a trick of early photographic technique, but when I held the image to the lamp, the details sharpened and I felt the first flicker of unease. Behind the wedding party, half hidden in the darkness of the doorway, stood another figure. I hadn't noticed her before. She was tall, slender, dressed in what appeared to be a light-colored gown, though the tones were indistinct. Her head tilted slightly to one side, her hands clasped before her as though in prayer or patience. At first, I assumed she was part of the gathering, perhaps a relative who'd drifted to the back. But there was something wrong with her posture. Everyone else in the picture had the faint rigidity of people posing. She alone appeared relaxed, natural, watching. I stared for several minutes, feeling a prickle behind my neck. The longer I looked, the less she seemed like a person, and the more she resembled an impression left on the film itself, too pale, too distinct, as if the photograph had remembered her against its will. On the back, in neat copperplate ink, was written, "Arthur and Lillian Shaw, Holy Trinity Church, June 2nd, 1935. Below it, in smaller script, "The happiest day of our lives." I almost laughed then, because it seemed so terribly ordinary, yet the handwriting trembled slightly in the lower curve of the S, as if whoever wrote it had done so through tears. I looked again at the photograph. The woman in the doorway was still there, waiting. The next morning, I called the auctioneer, who told me the album had come from the estate of a recently deceased widow, no living family. He thought the photograph rather charming and seemed surprised when I mentioned the odd figure. Probably the photographer caught one of the church staff in the background, he said. They used long exposures back then. People move. But she hadn't moved. That was what troubled me. Her outline was sharp, her features too composed. By the weekend, curiosity had replaced unease. I drove down to Guildford to see Holy Trinity Church. It was smaller than I'd imagined, tucked between tall yews, its stones blackened by weather and age. The vicar, a gentle, silver-haired man named Collins, welcomed me kindly when I explained my interest. He led me through the nave to the doorway I recognized from the photo. The proportions were the same, the arch of stone, the worn flagstones beneath. Ivy crawled along the outer wall, just as it had in 1935. "You say the Shaws married here?" he asked. "Ah, yes. There's a record of that, I'm sure." He showed me the parish ledgers, brittle pages filled with looping handwriting. Under the date June 2nd, 1935 was the entry: Arthur Henry Shaw and Lillian May Ellis, ceremony conducted by Reverend Benjamin Croft. But what caught my eye was a faint notation in the margin, nearly lost to time. Service delayed. Body discovered. Collins squinted. Good heavens, I've never noticed that before. I asked if there had been a death in the church that day. He didn't know, but offered to check the diocesan records. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid the photograph on my desk beneath the lamp, the way one might set a candle before a shrine. The figures stared out from their long-ago sunlight, the bride's lace veil trembling faintly in the photographic grain, and behind them, in the doorway, the woman watched still. The idea struck me then that she might have been the one found dead in the church, the body from the ledger note. I leaned close, tracing the outline of her dress, and felt a coldness in my fingertips that had nothing to do with the room. A few days later, Collins phoned me with what he'd found. There had indeed been a body discovered on the morning of June 2nd, 1935, an unidentified young woman, estimated to be in her 20s. The police report listed her as 5'8", auburn hair, no visible injuries. The cause of death was recorded simply as unknown. She had been found in the vestibule, precisely where the photograph's figure stood. Collins paused before adding, "The wedding was postponed for only an hour." I thanked him, but when I hung up the receiver, my hands were shaking. The next day, I went to the local history archive and requested newspapers from that week. On the front page of the Surrey Advertiser, June 3rd, 1935, was a brief article. Tragedy at local church. Woman found deceased in vestibule. The paragraph beneath it repeated the details Collins had given, but what made me cold was the final sentence: the body remains unclaimed. The wedding of Mr. and Mrs. Shaw proceeded later that morning. The following day's paper contained a smaller note. Funeral services for Miss Eleanor Shaw, aged 24, were held at Holy Trinity Church on Saturday, June 1st. Survived by her brother Arthur and parents. Cause of death: sudden illness. The implication struck me so hard I had to sit down. Eleanor Shaw, the same surname. The day before the wedding. I pulled the photograph from my case again. The resemblance, now that I knew to look for it, was unmistakable. The height, the delicate curve of the jaw, even the faint suggestion of curls near the shoulders. Arthur Shaw's sister had been buried the day before his wedding, and now she stood, impossibly, in the doorway of his wedding portrait. I returned to Holy Trinity a second time, though Collins seemed hesitant to let me inside. "We don't open after dusk," he said, smiling apologetically. "Old buildings, you know. The lights play tricks." I waited until morning. The church smelled of old wood and polish, the scent of candle wax lingering even though no candles burned. I walked slowly toward the vestibule, every sound amplified, the scuff of my shoes, the echo of breath. The door frame was lower than I expected, worn smooth by generations of hands. I ran my fingers along it, and the dust that came away felt sticky, as if mixed with something darker. When I bent closer, I saw faint letters carved into the inner beam. Still waiting. The grooves were shallow, but deliberate. They had been there for decades. I remember the light dimming just then, a passing cloud perhaps, though the sky had been clear. The temperature dropped enough for me to see my breath, and though I told myself it was my imagination, I thought I smelled lilies, the cloying, heavy sweetness of funeral flowers. I left quickly. My curiosity should have ended there. But obsession has a way of masquerading as purpose. Over the following weeks, I hunted every mention of the Shaws I could find. Birth records, parish notes, census lists. Arthur had been a clerk for the Southern Railway, Lillian, a schoolteacher. They had moved to a cottage in Devon after their marriage. A year later, Lillian was found dead in her bed, her countenance pale as wax, without sign of struggle. Arthur lived alone thereafter, dying in 1959, no children. The coroner's report on Lillian mentioned one oddity: traces of pollen, specifically lily pollen, on her hands and face. No lilies had been kept in the house. The photograph became my companion. I studied it nightly, enlarging it under digital magnification, charting the play of light across each figure. In the reflection of a window pane behind the group, I thought I could see the faint outline of another face, not the woman's, but something smaller, blurred, like a child peering out from inside. Sometimes, late at night, I caught the faintest sound, a rustle, like paper shifting of its own accord. Once, when I looked up from my desk, I could have sworn that one of the guests in the image had turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. But fatigue does strange things. I convinced myself it was illusion. Until the evening the lights flickered. I was scanning the photograph on my computer when the lamp beside me dimmed, then flared back to life. The scanner emitted a harsh whine and froze. For a second the image on the screen inverted, a negative. Everything white became black, and the figure in the doorway blazed bright as flame. Her hands were clasped tightly, and her head bowed slightly, as though acknowledging me. And then, for just an instant, I saw the bride's veil lift, as if stirred by a passing breeze. When the image returned to normal, I realized my tea had gone cold. The house was silent except for the faint tick of the clock. That night I dreamed of lilies. The following week, I met with Margaret Fielding from the Historical Society. She was one of those women who seemed to have been born in cardigans and spectacles, practical and unflappable. I showed her the photograph. She studied it for a long time before saying, "You know, that doorway looks just like the vestibule they used for laying out the dead. Before refrigeration, they'd keep the body there until the service." She leafed through a file she'd brought. "Here, see this? Parish correspondence from 1935. Reverend Croft wrote to the bishop about disturbances after the wedding, strange noises, organ notes playing at night. He said he feared the young Miss Shaw has not yet found her peace." I left with copies of the letters and a heaviness in my chest that no amount of logic could dispel. That night, as I sat again before the photograph, I thought I saw something impossible. The figure in the doorway seemed closer. The shadows around her had deepened, swallowing the space behind. And though I told myself it was a trick of the lamplight, I could almost make out the faint shimmer of a veil across her hair. I turned off the light and went to bed, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, still waiting, patient as stone. In the morning, I decided to return to the church once more, though I could not have said why. Perhaps I wanted proof that it was all coincidence, that the photograph had no power beyond my imagination. The day was grey and windless. Inside, the church felt colder than before. I walked straight to the vestibule. Dust motes swirled in the thin light. I leaned close to the doorframe where the words were carved. For the first time, I noticed something else. Tiny flecks of color embedded in the grooves, reddish-brown like dried blood. I stepped back. From where I stood, the angle of the doorway matched the photograph exactly. I could almost see the wedding party assembled in sunlight, hear the murmur of laughter. For a dizzying moment, I thought I did hear it, the faint echo of a woman's voice, distant and tender, as if calling someone's name. When I turned, the church was empty. But on the floor near the pews, something glimmered. I bent and picked it up, a small, corroded object. It was the clasp of a locket, shaped like a lily. Inside was a fragment of a photograph, a man and a woman, smiling, with a young girl between them. On the back, In the same looping hand as the wedding caption was written one word: Eleanor. The air around me shifted, and I knew then that the story I had been tracing was not yet finished. I folded the locket into my pocket and left quickly, the scent of lilies following me out into the daylight. I drove home through a rain that seemed determined to erase the road. Every mile the world blurred further into grey, and by the time I reached my street, the air felt heavy with the smell of damp soil and petrol. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it smelled like the past trying to breathe. I set the locket on my desk beside the wedding photograph and tried to convince myself that both were just relics, accidents of chemistry, of silver and paper. But when I looked again, I knew better. The photograph seemed different now. The sheen of its surface had dulled, and the shadows behind the wedding party had thickened into a uniform darkness that swallowed the doorway whole. I adjusted the lamp, thinking it was just a reflection, but the more light I added, the darker the doorway became. And deep within that darkness, the faint glimmer of a shape began to form. It was no longer the full figure of the woman I had seen before. It was only her face, or what should have been a face, pale as frost, emerging like something pressed against glass from the other side. The eyes were indistinct, but fixed. They seemed to know me. That night I dreamed again, not of lilies this time, but of a corridor, narrow, endless, lined with doors that opened onto nothing. At the far end stood the woman, her hands clasped as always, waiting. I woke to the sound of my scanner powering on by itself. The room was dark except for the narrow blue light from the monitor. On the screen was the photograph. The software had opened on its own, running a scan I hadn't initiated. The progress bar crept forward slowly, and with every second, the image on the screen grew brighter until the figure's face filled it completely. Then the light flickered and the power cut out. When I turned the lamp back on, the photograph had shifted. I stared at it, certain my mind was playing tricks. The bride's shoulder, once empty, now bore the faint suggestion of a hand resting upon it. The fingers were too long, the skin nearly translucent, but they were there. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning I rang Margaret. She answered on the second call, sounding groggy. "Peter, it's 7:30, she muttered. "There's something new," I said. "In the photograph. I need you to see it." She arrived by noon, bringing with her a thermos of tea and the steady patience of someone used to dealing with eccentrics. I spread the photograph and the locket on the table. She leaned over the image, squinting. "You're certain this hand wasn't here before?" "I've catalogued every inch of this picture," I said. "I'd stake my life on it." She studied it longer, then looked at me with something that wasn't quite disbelief. "You know, Peter, sometimes the chemicals in these old prints shift. Silver migration, ghosting. It can make patterns that look like shapes." I almost laughed. "Patterns don't move closer every week." She hesitated. "What do you mean?" I showed her the earlier scan on my computer, the one from 2 months before. The figure stood deep in the doorway then, distant and blurred. In the new scan, she had stepped forward, her face sharper, her body nearer to the wedding guests. The difference was undeniable. Margaret grew pale. "Good Lord," she whispered. We sat in silence. Outside, the wind scraped the branches against the windows. Finally she said, "Perhaps we should bring it back to the church. Return it to where it belongs." The word belongs struck me like a bell. That afternoon we drove back to Guildford. The sky was the colour of old pewter, and the rain had thinned to a mist that seemed to hang rather than fall. The church was empty when we arrived. Collins wasn't there. A younger curate let us in and left quickly, clearly uncomfortable. We laid the photograph on the altar rail beneath the dim light of a single candle. I don't know what we expected. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, from somewhere deep in the nave, came a faint sound, a single note from the organ, soft and sustained, like a breath drawn through wood. Margaret looked at me. "That's impossible," she said. "It's not even plugged in." The note continued, trembling, then fell silent. The candle guttered. A draught passed through the church, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of lilies. I took the photograph and turned toward the doorway. The air there was colder than the rest of the church, dense enough to make the skin on my arms rise. The carved words, "Still waiting," caught what little light remained. For a moment, I saw movement, not in the air, but in the photograph itself. The bride's head tilted fractionally to the right. Margaret gasped. "Peter, stop. Let's go." But I couldn't move. There was a low hum building beneath my feet, like a faraway train approaching. I pressed the photograph against the wood of the doorframe. The vibrations seemed to flow from the print into the church itself, a current connecting paper to stone, and then the light changed. It wasn't sudden, not the way a lamp flickers. It deepened, as if the daylight outside had been swallowed whole. The doorway darkened until it was blacker than shadow. I could see nothing, yet I felt the certainty of presence, the weight of someone standing inches away. "Eleanor?" I heard myself say. The name left my mouth before I decided to speak. For an instant, the darkness answered. A hand, pale, thin, unmistakably human, reached out from the void and touched the edge of the photograph. I saw every detail: the smooth skin, the faint indentation where a ring had once been. The contact was light as dust, but it burned cold. Margaret screamed. I turned, and she was gone. The door behind her stood open, swinging gently on its hinges. When I looked back, the hand had withdrawn. The photograph lay flat against the stone, its surface shimmering like water. Within it, the figures began to move. They shifted slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. The groom's head turned first, then the bride's. Their faces were pale, their smiles dissolving. The guests behind them blurred, fading into the background until only the doorway remained, and in it the woman stepped forward. Her eyes opened fully now, and for the first time I saw her expression. It wasn't anger or sorrow, it was recognition. She reached toward me, and the edges of the print rippled outward, as if the photograph were breathing. The next thing I remember is running. I don't recall leaving the church, only the sensation of cold air tearing at my lungs. I must have driven home on instinct. When I reached my house, the photograph was still clutched in my hand. The edges were wet, as though I'd pulled it from water. Margaret never spoke to me again. She resigned from the Historical Society and moved north. Her colleagues said she'd had a change of nerves. I tried to destroy the photograph. I burned it, or thought I did. The paper blackened and curled, but when the ash cooled, the image was still there, unblemished, lying among the embers. I buried it, sealed it in a tin, threw it into the river. A week later, it was waiting on my desk, dry and spotless, exactly where it had always been. That was when I began to write everything down. These notes, these dates, this record, perhaps as a way of proving that what happened was real, or perhaps as an act of confession. Because I have come to believe that Eleanor Shaw did not die at all, not in any way we understand. In the years since, the photograph has continued to change. Every few months, when I can bring myself to look, I notice some new detail. The figures in the background have thinned, their outlines fading as though consumed by the dark. The bride and groom remain, but their faces are drawn, aged far beyond their years, and the figure that once lingered in the doorway now stands between them, her hand resting fully on the bride's shoulder. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I hear the soft click of a camera shutter from somewhere in the dark. Other times, I wake to find the photograph lying on the floor beside my bed, turned face up. The most recent change came last winter. I was examining a new high-resolution scan under bright light when I saw something I hadn't before. A shape just visible behind the woman's gown, leaning against the wall inside the church. A wooden box, half open. On its lid, faintly etched, were the words, June 1st, 1935. I checked the burial registry the next morning. That was the day of Eleanor's funeral. I stopped going out after that. I sealed the windows, covered the mirrors. But even as I write this, I can feel the temperature dropping again. The scent of lilies has returned, faint at first, then stronger, filling every corner of the room. The photograph lies beside me now. It no longer frightens me the way it once did. The faces within have grown so clear they might as well be alive. The bride's eyes have turned toward me, and her mouth, once fixed in a polite smile, now forms a small, round O, as if speaking a word I cannot yet hear. I think she's trying to tell me it's time. If anyone finds these pages, the photograph will likely be near. You'll know it by the way it seems to watch you, by the warmth that leaves the room when you look too long. Don't bother trying to destroy it. I've already learned how futile that is. I can feel her now, just behind me, the air stirring faintly, as though someone were leaning close. There's a light forming in the corner of my eye, soft, white, like a doorway opening onto sunlight. She's stepped out at last. I'll go to her.